Good afternoon. I'm John Pierce, Dean of the Faculty of Environment, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to John Calvert's lecture on the current crisis at BC Hydro and can it be resolved. I thought I'd just connect a few dots for you today regarding John's background and how he actually found his way into researching this relatively controversial issue. John grew up in London, Ontario, went to Western where he did his undergrad and grad degrees, and then he went on to London School of Economics and graduated there in 1977, just a year after I graduated there, even though we actually never knew each other at LSE. For many years, John worked as a researcher in the National Office of the Canadian Union of Public Employees in Ottawa. And he came to British Columbia in 1993 and worked for the provincial government in many different ministries, which I will not repeat here, other than the last one here, which of course caught my attention, the Crown Corporation Secretariat, which was the central government agency that oversaw BC Hydro. And this is where he got his interest in hydro and electricity policy. John became a member of the 2004 and 5 Hydro Integrated Electricity Planning Committee, and in 2007 he published Liquid Gold, which was a critical look at the provincial government's electricity policies. And Liquid Gold was controversial, and it contributed to a significant and important debate over the role of private power developers in BC's electricity system and the future impacts of the government's policy agenda on BC Hydro. Today, John is currently a research associate in addition to his work in the Faculty of Health Sciences as a policy specialist, but John is also a research associate with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and a member of the board of the Wilderness Committee of British Columbia. He's co-investigator in a SSHRC-funded research project entitled, which I'd like to hear actually more about, Work in a Warming World, which is examining the impact of global warming on work and employment. So please join with me in welcoming John Calvert.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Price, and let me just express how privileged I feel to be here and to be able to have the opportunity to express my views about what's happening at BC Hydro. John gave you a little bit of my background, so I'm not going to say very much about it, except I did write this book in 2007, and I'm going to talk a bit about some of the themes in the book and some of the policy developments that we've seen since 2007 as well. And all of that is leading to kind of an assessment of the situation that BC Hydro is now in. And as you'll hear from me later, there are some really serious problems at BC Hydro these days that really do need to be addressed by some major changes. A few acknowledgements in terms of the work I've done over the years. Marjorie Griffin-Cohen has been a stalwart inspiration to me on electricity issues. She was a former board member of BC Hydro. Jim Quayle, who worked for many years with PIAC, Public Interest Advocacy Group. Marvin Schaefer, of course, who is an adjunct professor and an economist who's done a lot of work on hydro issues over the years. A woman named Sharon Better, who wrote a book called Power Play, which is sort of my Bible in terms of international electricity issues. Rafe Mayer, who I've come to know in the last few years because he sort of picked up the torch and became very much involved in this private power issue over the last 4 or 5 years. And Mark Lee, an associate at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. So I have learned a lot from all of these people. John quickly gave you my background, so I don't think that I need to say too much more about that, except to say that my interest in all of this arose, as he pointed out initially, in my work in the Crown Corporation Secretariat, which oversaw BC Hydro. And subsequently, I was asked by Citizens for Public Power to do a submission on the rate application of BC Hydro in 2003, and that got me back into the area. And then I was asked, to my surprise actually, to be on the integrated electricity planning process of BC Hydro, which took 18 months and was quite an intensive process and gave me an opportunity to learn a lot about what was happening at the time. And also, I guess, to be as blunt as possible, it made me very concerned about what was happening at Hydro. So the book, and just some of this is a bit of history, but I think it's important to understand why Hydro is in its current situation and why it has the problems it now has. So in terms of the book that I wrote, I was very concerned about the way in which the government was deliberately expanding the role of private power producers in BC's electricity system, concerned about the high cost of private power and the implications of long-term private ownership of our future electricity generation facilities. And I thought this would be hugely expensive to the public down the road because we're no longer going to be owners of our own electricity generation plants. I also was very concerned, and I didn't think that there was enough discussion about this at the time, of the what I saw as a sort of giveaway or privatization of our public water assets, that is water licenses for building hydropower facilities, and also wind farm tenures across the province. One of the chapters in the book dealt also with the whole environmental side of this, namely the extent to which the construction of all these small hydro facilities around the province was really having a major negative impact on the environment and allowing new kinds of development in really pristine areas of BC that I felt really should not be disturbed in the way they were being disturbed by these projects, especially given the relatively small amounts of energy that was being developed. I was also worried about the impact of the government really following the U.S. lead in terms of this U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC as we call it, its agenda for deregulating and breaking up public utilities. And finally, I thought that all of this would lead to major negative repercussions for BC Hydro in terms of its finances and in terms of its ability to deliver electricity to the public here in BC. So, just a quick overview. You know, in 1962, the big decision was made by W.A.C. Bennett, the SOCRED Premier, to establish BC Hydro as a publicly owned electricity utility. And his purpose was obviously to supply the province with the power it needed, and particularly the resource sector. For the next 40 years, roughly, it provided power at low cost to ratepayers and provided billions of dollars of dividends to the province. And I have some tables that deal with this, but it was a lot of money that we got back by virtue of owning the resource, owning the utility, and arguably a very successful model. So in 2001, with the change in government, there was a fundamental shift in the approach towards both the electricity system in BC and also towards BC Hydro. And arguably these are the most significant changes that were followed in the next decade that we've seen since way back in 1962. The changes suggested to me anyway that what we were seeing was a kind of incremental privatization of our electricity system as more and more private power was being encouraged to be developed. And I also thought this would change to a significant degree the politics of electricity in BC. That is to say, we would have a lot of new players, new private power companies involved in trying to shape electricity policy, obviously in the interest of the shareholders that they represented. And finally, I guess I was concerned that things like the giveaway of the water licenses and wind farm tenures, these were essentially permanent transfers of public resources to private interests that would be very difficult to reverse in the future. There is a bit of international background. I'm not going to spend very much time on this, but if you recall around the year 2000, 2001, there was a lot of discussion, in fact even earlier, going back to the early 90s, about restructuring electricity utilities around the world. and there was a kind of standard market design that was developed in which you would separate transmission from generation and distribution. You would push for deregulation of parts of the operation of utilities. You would create competitive electricity markets. And a lot of this was accompanied in most jurisdictions, as for example in the UK and parts of Australia and so on, with the privatization of all or part of the previous publicly owned utilities. Sharon Better, who I mentioned earlier, is sort of my guru on this, has documented these international trends very effectively in her book Power Play. And I was certainly influenced by the thinking of people like her in the sense that I felt that following this path was not a good thing for BC to do, that there were major drawbacks and major concerns about issues like price manipulation, which we saw in California with the Enron crisis, and that these were not accidents, as it were, or the result of poor planning by government, but rather they were inherent characteristics of this deregulated market model, and that gaming, to use the term that's widely adopted in the industry, gaming was an inherent characteristic of these deregulated energy markets. I have a quote here from a fellow who was chair of the California Power Authority during the California crisis, and I'll just read it to you for a minute here. It says, "There's one fundamental lesson we must learn from this California experience. Electricity is really different from anything else. It cannot be stored, it cannot be seen, and we cannot do without it, which makes opportunities to take advantage of a deregulated market endless. It is a public good that must be protected from private abuse. If Murphy's Law were written for a market approach to electricity, then the law would state any system that can be gamed will be gamed, and at the worst possible time. And a market approach for electricity is inherently gameable. Never again can we allow private interests to create artificial or even real shortages and to be in control." So I guess that's very briefly my take on the international issues around electricity deregulation, privatization, and so on. I won't say anything more in my talk, but if you want to raise that issue later, that would be fine with me. So in coming back to BC, what I've tried to do is outline the major changes in the electricity system that we've seen over the last decade. They started, there are basically three major ones and a lot of minor adjustments as well, and little pieces of legislation here and there. But the three big ones are the 2002 Energy Plan, the 2007 revisions of the Energy Plan, and the 2010 Clean Energy Act. And just sort of line them, this is from a paper that Marjorie Cohen and I did last fall, the three different components, arguably, of the transformation of our electricity system that have had such an impact on BC Hydro. I'd like just to go through each of these very briefly to give you a sense of the changes that were entailed with each of these developments and the significance of those changes. So the 2002 Energy Plan, titled Energy for a Future, Plan for BC. What it did, if some of you may recall this, it said that, or required BC Hydro to contract out about a third of its workforce to a company called Accenture. So this is a partial privatization of the actual operation of the utility. It said that BC Hydro wouldn't be allowed to build new hydroelectric facilities, new power plants, that all of that was now going to be reserved for private power developers, with the vague exception of Site C, which at the time seemed very, very unlikely. Said that coal-fired power generation was okay. They changed their mind about that later. It said that basically Hydro should implement a more US-style approach in terms of opening up the grid to private energy access and encourage private exports. It also entailed breaking up BC Hydro. So the transmission system was carved out in 2002 with a separate piece of legislation setting up the BC Transmission Corporation. And all of this sort of followed the US FERC model of how you restructure a utility. The government also lifted the rate freeze that had been in place, I think, for the previous 8 or 9 years. Instituted a heritage contract, which was designed to provide some vague assurance to the public that the very low-cost power that Hydro owned would continue to be benefiting ratepayers in the future, and allowed electricity generators privately to sell directly to industrial customers if they wanted to. Not much of that really happened, but the door is open for that. So what are the implications of this? Well, a third of the workforce was pulled out of hydro, which was hugely disruptive to the utility. The direction to hydro to source a lot of new energy from private power developers triggered what I described, many others as well, as a kind of private gold rush. Previously, there had been some acquisitions of water licenses by small private developers, but until hydro provided a guaranteed market for the power that they would build and secured that with contracts with the private sector, contracts normally lasting 20, 30, maybe 40 years, depending on what was negotiated. Until that security was provided through BC Hydro contracts, there wasn't a huge interest in developing any of these tiny sites. As soon as Hydro was directed to do that, they provided a market, a guaranteed public market, that enabled the developers then, having secured a water license and did a bit of engineering and a bit of environmental scoping, they could go to Hydro, bid in on a contract. Once they had the Hydro contract, they could go to the bank and borrow the money and then build the power plant and sell the power back to Hydro. So it was a great deal from their point of view and dependent entirely on indirect public financing. So you had, as a result, this gold rush of private power developers scrambling to get as many water licenses tied up as they possibly could in all the best sites around the province, and ditto for wind farm developers as well for the license of occupation. And I felt a certain sense of outrage about this. These were public assets, and they were simply being virtually given away for almost nothing. Water license was $5,000 or $10,000, absolutely ridiculously cheap. Very little coming back to the public. And so I thought this giveaway was very unacceptable. And especially as I didn't think the government had done any serious investigations what all of this meant in terms of the loss to the public of these assets or the consequences of having all these projects built. So one of the organizations I was involved in, the Citizens for Public Power, we did this map, courtesy also of a fellow named Williams in North Vancouver, who was able to do the mapping for us by locating all the water licenses that were registered with the Ministry of Environment and then putting them on a map for us to see. And this shows you the scope of these little dots show the scope of the sort of gold rush for getting these various locations tied up. I've got two other little maps. This is one that shows you a bit more of the lower mainland. The red dots are all the applications, and this is from about 2010. The green dots are ones that were approved, and then the blue dots are where water power licenses are actually generating power. So you can see the number of projects, a number of water licenses that were being grabbed by various power developers around the province. A lot of these, by the way, just got flipped. So the individuals who got the power license initially, because it had a real value then, sold it to a larger energy company that could then build a power plant. And this, just a further one, just shows you this area adjacent to Vancouver Island, how many projects potentially could be built there. This is, again, Jeremy Williams did this table from IPP Watch. 151 licenses have been granted as of September 1st, 2010. 154 points of diversion. Sometimes there's river has two spots where you can divert the water to a single power plant. 627 licenses outstanding at the time and 758 points of diversion. So huge scramble to get water licenses. I did a whole chapter in my book about wind farms and what was going on there in terms of essentially the giveaway of wind farm tenures all over the province. BC Hydro had found almost all these locations and work it had done since 1981, so it knew where the best sites were already. But it was told under the 2002 energy plan it could not build anything, could not do any wind power whatsoever. It all had to be private. And so the sites were essentially transferred over to various private companies. I have a map of that, but time constraints mean I can't show you at this point. So what does this mean in terms of money? Well, BC Hydro was being directed to buy certain volumes of energy. It had to meet those quotas. And the biggest purchase in the period from 2005, 2006 was this 15.6 billion purchase. And the average price was $87.50 per megawatt hour. That's about 8.7 cents a kilowatt hour to translate it into what most of us know in terms of our home electricity. This was about double what the U.S. Energy Information Agency was predicting at the time. And BC Hydro actually had tables in a submission to the Utility Commission showing the projections of the U.S. government for future energy prices and comparing them with what it was going to be paying. And there was a huge gap, which meant a huge risk for ratepayers in terms of these very high prices. Even though BC Hydro was going to pay these very large, very high prices for this energy, it was no longer getting any assets because it had to buy them from private power producers. And this was essentially enabling them to acquire the financial commitments that were necessary for them to build the projects. The other thing is that there were major environmental impacts of all of this. And again, I did a chapter in my book flagging this and showing some of the impacts in various areas of the province, which I felt should not be opened up to these private power projects. This is just show you a transmission line built into a project at the Ashley River, now completed. This is the size of one of these molds that was drilling a penstock. I think this penstock was about 6 or 7 kilometers long. And you have all this waste rock that's got to be dumped somewhere. Of course, these are big industrial projects. And you go into an area that's had no development whatsoever, and suddenly massive construction project. You've got roads that go in. You've got, of course, the site itself. You've got the penstock that's got to be drilled. You've got to have a small pond, as it were, for the sediment to settle before you take the water out and put it in the penstock. So a lot of impacts on pristine forests and pristine areas of the province, again, that I didn't think was justified. Also, the 2002 energy plan did undermine some of the synergies inside BC Hydro. There are some huge advantages in being an integrated utility. And by breaking it apart, there were losses of certain economies that Hydro otherwise had. Similar with the opening up of the market and the change in the way in which it was dispatching electricity and so on. The other thing was, of course, that you were getting out of province and out of country energy companies moving into our electricity system in a major way for the first time. There had been some before, and obviously we can talk about Alcan, which had been there since the 50s, but it wasn't until fairly recently seen as an electricity private power producer. It was an aluminum company, although it's kind of reconfigured itself in the last decade as to portray itself as an independent power producer, whatever that means. So we did this map around 2008 or 2009, just showing some of the companies that were involved in this scramble to get water licenses and to acquire projects. I would argue now that this is about 3-4 years old, that you'd see a lot of different companies there because of all the sales and the flipping of assets that have gone on. For example, the big one is General Electric now is the largest private power owner in the province outside of Alcan and Tecumseh. They were not a major or significant player at all before, but they bought a large share of Plutonic Power's projects up East Toba Inlet and so on. So we tried to sort of document what actually was happening in terms of the ownership of these projects. And the logic, from my point of view, is very simple, that you have to be a very big player in the energy market to really succeed. The idea that you can run a little tiny power plant producing, or that's a size of, say, 5 or 10 megawatts and survive easily in this market, I don't think so. So you have this consolidation. It's I think, an inevitable part of how this process works. So let me move on. 2007 energy plan. This established what were called arbitrary self-sufficiency targets for BC Hydro. And they were artificial because they were based in part on determining the lowest possible rainfall years. And then saying down the road by 2026 that BC Hydro would have to, first it would have to base its planning and acquisition of power from private power developers on the assumption that it had to meet the requirements in the very lowest year, and then it had to have a surplus planned by 2026 as well. So all of this was to force it to buy much more private power. And there were a number of other changes: establishment of a standing offer program for small projects, direction to the Transmission Corporation to speed up building power lines to new private projects. And there were some environmental components to this. The zero greenhouse gas emissions from coal-fired electricity generation, a flip-flop on that issue. So we couldn't have coal-fired plants anymore because you can't have one with zero greenhouse emissions. They also said that Burrard Thermal, the plant in, just on the other side of the inlet here, could not be used anymore for planning purposes. We hardly ever ran a Burrard plant, about 3% of its potential energy generation, and we just use it mainly in December when we really have a peak demand. But by taking it out of the planning, then you had to buy more power to substitute for what it would otherwise do. And so that encouraged even more private power purchases. The heritage contract was extended in perpetuity, and consultations on Site C. What I would see is the great irony of this, and I'll talk about it a bit more in a minute, but these private power projects have real limitations in terms of they don't have reservoirs for the most part, and the power comes at the wrong time and so on. So you can see that some of the large industrial customers who need guaranteed power year-round were seeing that they needed something beyond this kind of power that was coming into the system, and Site C would meet those criteria from their perspective. Throughout maybe the late period from about 2004, 2005 till about 2010, there was what I would describe as the great self-sufficiency debate. The government kept claiming there was a critical energy shortage, and that's why we had to buy all this new private power. We weren't self-sufficient anymore, and there were projections, of course, of future energy demand in the province over the next 30 years. And so based on those projections, the government was systematically pushing BC Hydro to buy more energy. It takes, just as an aside, it takes about 6 or 8 years or longer from the time you decide you're going to build a power plant to the time it actually starts delivering energy, which is why you need long-term planning and all this. Okay. So what was the problem with this? Well, there's a large block of power the government owns through the Columbia Treaty process that was negotiated way back in 1961-62. And that power is power that's generated on the Columbia River. It's our entitlement because of the reservoirs, the 3 big reservoirs we built on the Columbia River. We're entitled to half the benefit, which is about 4,300 gigawatt hours a year. Big block of power. We use about 50,000 gigawatts of energy a year, so it's about 8% of our total usage. And then there was a fair bit of private power, not huge, but Alcan and a bit of Tech Cominco and so on. The question was, which of these blocks of power do you include in the numbers? Well, the government always excluded all the other components except what BC Hydro itself had in its system. And others in that debate, including myself, said, well, hold on, we should include Columbia River downstream benefits and other sources of power inside the province that we have. And depending on which set of numbers you used, either we had a deficit in power or actually we were doing reasonably well and had a slight surplus the last 5 or 6 years. But regardless of that, the governments are pushed ahead with this. Said that BC Hydro should continue to buy more private power to meet these projections. Marvin Schaefer, who teaches in the public policy program at SFU, did a very nice analysis of this about 4 years ago, a lost in transmission, he called it, and it was an analysis of the huge cost to ratepayers of BC Hydro being required to buy this very expensive energy. So all this is the 2000 energy plan and the fallout from it. What's wrong with this energy? Very quickly, it's intermittent. So the hydropower that's generated from these new small run-of-river power plants is mainly during the spring freshet. It's not power that's usable or available even for the most part in November, December, early January when BC really needs power. When people have the lights on at night because people are using their electric heating if they've got that and so on. That's when we really need power. It's not delivering then. It's delivering during the spring freshet when the Peace and Columbia rivers are also flowing with water. And there's we have all those dams down the Columbia River south of us also generating energy from the spring freshet. So at this point in time, there's a surplus of electricity normally in the Pacific Northwest, but this is where BC Hydro is buying all this new energy. There's huge price risk in this because of the very high prices being paid for this energy, which is non-firm energy, which is coming at the wrong time of year. We're paying upwards of $100 a megawatt hour. And if you look at the market price south of the border for this energy at that time, it's $25 to $30, sometimes even lower. I got some other numbers further along. So by committing to buy this energy over, say, a 30 or 35-year period in these contracts at these very high prices, inflation index, by the way, we are taking huge risks as ratepayers because we have to pay this, not the private power developers. They're guaranteed their money. So, moving on, 2010, we have the Clean Energy Act. It required that the self-sufficiency be moved forward from 2026 to 2020. So you had even more private power purchases being demanded of BC Hydro. And also there was the inclusion for the first time more explicitly of this idea of BC becoming a net exporter of so-called green energy. Because a lot of this would have had a really tough time at Utilities Commission under the current legal framework. The government also exempted a whole range of decisions from oversight by the BCUC. And that included, and I've just listed them here, the Northwest Transmission Line, some refurbishment of some new turbines in Hydro's own dams, Mica Units 5 and 6 and Revelstoke Unit 6. Site C, the whole process was taken out. The bioenergy call, 3,000 gigawatt hours, as I recall, of energy. The smart meter program, which has been so controversial. A standing offer program, and a clean power request for proposal. All these things were excluded from oversight by the BCUC. It did a couple of other things that were also interesting. It said that the Transmission Corporation, which had been carved out in 2002, was now going to be reintegrated into BC Hydro. And one other thing it said that was important, that the Burrard Thermal would be essentially completely excluded from any kind of future planning. So its potential was no longer something that BC Hydro could rely on. So there's no public review of all of this. It was rammed through as legislation. And these all involve huge investments by BC Hydro, which means you and I as the ratepayers at the end of the day. And so there was no opportunity really for any kind of effective public debate and input into this process. Some of the things that were excluded, I don't know why. I mean, the turbines in BC Hydro's dams, it makes sense anyway. They should do that. And so why they needed to exclude it, I wasn't clear about. Burrard was just to force BC Hydro to buy more energy. And certainly people were concerned that part of the reason for that was just to force purchases of more private power. The other thing, biomass, was something that BC Hydro is now starting to buy in a major way. The 3,000 gigawatt hours of biomass has been purchased, I think, 2010. This is made from wood waste, some pine beetle wood, some black liquor, whatever, mainly from pulp mills. There's some issues around that, certainly controversy about how green biomass is. I don't have a full answer to that myself, but I know that there is controversy over that. It's also very expensive. We're talking well over $100 a megawatt hour to buy this energy. The smart meters, we could talk about that in our discussion. I don't want to go into it too much now, but $930 million of investment in this program. And not clear in my view how time of use metering is going to have any benefit in our system that we've got. Then the reintegration of the BC Transmission Corporation, which was something that many of us thought was a stupid move in the first place to carve it out. The numbers showed that it cost $65 million to reintegrate it, and they said they were making $25 million in savings every year onwards as a result. So when you calculate how many years it was actually separated from hydro, plus the $65 million, we spent $250 million on this little experiment that failed. The Clean Energy Act also was forcing BC Hydro to make some more investments in new transmission infrastructure. Again, lots of risks for ratepayers, again, what I'll come to in a minute. And then the feed-in tariff program. So lots of new requirements in BC Hydro, many of them very problematic, not subject to public debate. We had a new premier, as you know. Gordon Campbell went to London. And BC Hydro, in the fall of 2010, I'm not sure it was just before or just after the new premier came in. Anyway, submitted to the BCUC its revenue requirement application and indicated that it would need 33% increase over 3 years to cover costs and 100% over the decade to 2021. Huge increases in rates. Now people are starting to pay attention to what's going on in BC Hydro. They're starting to see 10% every year rate increases. What's happening here? How could this be? The government, obviously very sensitive to all of this, set up a review of BC Hydro. 3 deputy ministers, not clear how much background they had in electrical utilities, but they were set up to oversee this review and to find out how they could somehow limit the size of the rate increases and make savings in terms of BC Hydro's operations. So this is a review of BC Hydro. One of the things that came out in the review that was really very interesting is that the review noted that BC Hydro was now paying $124 a megawatt hour for its new energy in the latest, in the 2010 tender call. Huge amount, eh? And it said the range of prices that BC Hydro could get for its energy on the market if it had to sell this energy and couldn't use it, varied from $4.34 to $53.43 a megawatt hour. And I went and looked at the EIA data for the average price of electricity in Pacific Northwest at the Columbia Trading Hub in 2010. It was $35.96. So we're paying $124 a megawatt hour locked-in contracts for energy that's on the market at, on average over the whole year, $35.96. Not really very good numbers from the ratepayer's point of view. The review, and I just got a quote from it, review said, this surplus energy, which would range from 3,000 gigawatt hours in critical water years to 7,000 or 8,000 gigawatt hours in average water years and 14,000 gigawatt hours in favorable water years, that's the year when there's lots of rainfall, must then be sold on the export market. This, I love the way they said this, this could result in losses should the export market return less than the cost of generating or purchasing that energy. I just showed you the numbers back here. So that's what they said in a very delicate way. And as a result, they recommended that the self-sufficiency insurance should go, that it didn't make sense, and it went. Just to give you a sense of the energy purchase agreements that we've entered into, I'm sorry the numbers are a little bit small, but basically there are about 19,164 gigawatt hours per year of energy contracted that are active right now. A huge amount of private energy, and obviously not nearly as much as what BC Hydro still generates from its own facilities, but it's a huge legacy that we're going to have to deal with down the road. The results of the review, while they recommended that the insurance surplus should go, Hydro should cut its workforce by 1,000 employees, very damaging obviously to workforce and morale, and that they should lower the rates. Which ultimately just meant instead of paying for things now, you're going to pay for them later. But that would get them through, arguably and perhaps cynically, to the next election. And so they've applied to the Utilities Commission. This is truly bizarre, first time it's ever happened as far as I'm aware, to change what they originally applied for in November of 2010 to lower their request for the revenue that they're going to need in terms of the rate increase to 3.9 and 3.9%. This doesn't make any sense. They actually do need the money, and all it does is postpone the day of reckoning down the road. The Auditor General has looked at BC Hydro's finances as well, raised some other concerns, and I'm not an expert here, not an accountant, but I'll just read you two quick quotes about what his view was about hydro. This has to do with what are called deferral accounts. And deferral accounts have some rationale. There's reasons to make future ratepayers pay for benefits we're investing in now that benefit them in the future. So, but what he said about this is they've gone overboard with this. Currently, BC Hydro's financial statements contain a net total of $2.2 billion in deferred costs to be expensed in future years. By government's own estimate, the balance of rate-regulated deferrals is already large and is projected to balloon to almost $5 billion by 2017. And then he goes on to say, growth of deferral accounts cannot continue indefinitely. I am concerned that there does not appear to be a plan to reduce the balance of these accounts, let alone halt their growth. Rate-regulated accounts must be managed carefully. If overused, rate-regulated deferrals can mask the true cost of doing business, distort the financial condition of an enterprise, and place undue burden on future ratepayers. So he's saying there's real problems. I should emphasize, and I'm not sure I made this point earlier, but we now have, according to BC Hydro's last annual report, financial obligations totaling over $40 billion in contract commitments that we've signed for private power. It's on page 80, footnote, I think it's 26, in their last annual report. $40 billion is a lot of money, and those are locked-in contracts that we're going to have to pay down the road. So recent developments, one last thing before I conclude here. There have been some major changes in the last year and a half, 2 years, that also have huge impacts on BC Hydro and have changed in many ways the whole debate. The government is very committed to this resource extraction agenda. And there are three key areas that are critical here. One is the expansion of natural gas production. The second is the new mines. And the third, these LNG plants. There's 3, maybe 4 LNG plants that the government is hoping will be built. From a hydro point of view, none of this makes any sense. Although we're probably on balance in terms of the energy we've got, we don't have a surplus, don't have a huge deficit. Nonetheless, we don't have the extra power for these new plants. Not at all. And let me just show you very, very quickly. There's the oil and gas side. There's one of their lovely publications about oil and gas development. The whole Dawson Creek Chetwynd area is being developed, and they may also do Horn River further north. The Dawson Creek Chetwynd area, they're talking about something like a need for 363 megawatts of power by 2027, or maybe as much as 500 megawatts of power. That's over half of Site C's capacity, right there, just that one area, right? This is one of the maps of the BC Hydro is going to build these transmission lines. It's been delayed a bit, but it's got to build all these new transmission lines to service the gas fields. And when they're exhausted, what happens? The transmission lines are what are called stranded assets. Mining, this is the second one. Huge expansion of mining in the province. This is from the website of the Mining Association of BC, and they're saying 5 major mine expansions, 2 mines in construction, 6 major mines in advanced development. They've listed them all. Expanding coal. The Northwest Power Line, when it's built, will open up $15 billion more in future mining opportunities. A lot of exploration in mining as well. And according to the BC Environmental Assessment Office, 27 new projects are undergoing environmental reviews. This is just a listing from there. I don't expect you to look at all the numbers here, but you get a sense of how many mining projects are in the pipeline. This is a map showing some of them as well. Mines use a lot of power, huge amount of power. So this is going to be very costly to BC Hydro. Marvin Schaefer did a study a couple of years ago looking at one mine, and we're selling energy to the mine at the time it was around $36, $37 a megawatt hour. and buying new energy at that time, it was 87.50 he was calculating. And so just to supply that one mine, BC Hydro would be losing $37 million a year as long as the mine operated on those calculations. I recalculated in a paper that we did recently, and it looks more like it would be about $60 million every year. The rest of the ratepayers would have to cross-subsidize to provide power at $40 a megawatt hour to the mine, because we're buying it at 120 now. So the third area is LNG plants. We've got 3, maybe 4. The one that Kitimat, and there's different numbers, and so this is kind of a moving target in a way, but what I think Jim Quayle has been saying is something like it's going to use 1,600 megawatts of power. Site C is about 1,000, a little bit less than 1,000. So 1.5 Site Cs. Maybe that's a slight overestimate, but what are we talking about here? There's huge amounts of new power that we don't have, that the government is committing us to supply. And at the prices that I've been telling you about, $124 a megawatt hour or more, where does it all come from? How does it all add up? Let me just go back very quickly about the industrial costs here. We're currently charging pulp mills and other large industrial customers, it's called the transmission rate. We charge them $40 roughly a megawatt hour. We're buying it at 124 according to the review that the government had last year. This is new energy. So this is what the cost will be to supply the extra energy to these facilities. It's a lot. How can we buy energy at 3 times what we're going to sell it for? It makes no sense. And so, but Christy Clark committed that we'd supply the LNG plant with electricity. I don't know how we can do that and not really push up the rates for ratepayers here. Hydro doesn't have the power, and the numbers don't add up. But the other thing is that if these developments go forward, it seems to me, and it's already happened I think in the last week or so, that realizing that they're not going to be able to supply electricity for these LNG plants, that I think the second one now they've announced that they're going to actually use gas, which is what they do the rest of the world. But that blows a huge hole in your GHG emission targets. You're now talking about reducing or increasing your GHG targets quite substantially. And if all these other gas-based facilities are going to use gas instead of electricity, again, the GHG implications are really quite large. One last point about all of this in terms of the development. We've got stranded asset issues here. The market in Asia looks great. We're going to spend all this money, you and I as owners of hydro, to build transmission lines and generating stations, everything to supply these new resource sector industries. But if the market collapses, what happens then? We've invested in all this infrastructure, but there's no guarantee that we're going to get the return back from some of these projects down the road. And there is a history in BC of stranded assets. Think about the Northeast coal. So concluding thoughts, well, BC Hydro is in big trouble. The idea that you can fix the problem by reducing the rates to 3.9% for the next couple of years doesn't add up. Rates are minimally going to double over the next decade. We still have this $40 billion worth of contracts that are signed and that we're going to have to pay for over the next 30 years or so, roughly. We still have this problem of the construction of all this infrastructure that we're going to have to pay for. So there's a lot of issues out here in hydro that we really need to get our heads around, and a lot of concerns. It's not something that I think we can easily fix. And certainly the giveaway of wind farm tenures and water licenses, I think that was horrible, horrible decision by the government. And finally, in terms of what hydro can provide down the road, it used to provide a very nice dividend to the province. So on all of that is gone. The only way we can get a big dividend out of hydro down the road is to actually raise our rates even further, which is not something I think most people are very happy about. So with that, just take a Valium.
Thanks, John. We've got time for questions. If you don't mind going to the mic there, so we can record this.
Thanks, John, for a great overview and an excellent talk. You spoke about the recent workforce layoffs at Hydro. To what extent is there a consciousness amongst those workers about what you've talked to us today about? Do they understand why they're getting laid off?
Oh, I think so, yes. The question was, to what extent do the workers at BC Hydro appreciate that some of these developments I've described are what is really the cause of the layoffs that they're now experiencing? I think they do. And I think from what I've heard, and you know, I'm not doing surveys there, so it's anecdotal what I'm going to say, but that the morale at Hydro has been really weakened by these decisions. And you think about a corporation that has around 5,000 roughly employees, and you lay off 1,000. That's a huge hit. So it means like every fifth worker basically. Lots of your friends and colleagues are going out the door, and a lot of the workforce at Hydro actually have had a long-standing commitment. They actually care about supplying us with electricity. It's important to them. And to see all this happen to this corporation that many of them have given years of service to is hard for them. They are aware, I think.
I'd like to say one thing. Like, I've got a family who's worked with Hydro for like 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
I work with Accenture. The whole shift over to the private sector, and I work in with the linemen, and they're not allowed to work any overtime. Whereas we have the private sector guys doing the same job, and a lot of times not with the same quality control, and they're getting paid the double time that these guys can. So there's a real ideological shift away from public crown corporation and allowing people who worked for our province and then having a company that sends its dividends and profit sharing outside of the country. So there's a lot of issue going on there, and the media right now really have moved into the ideological shift of talking about private industry. So the whole layoffs of 1,000 people, the general auditor's inquest said that there's 1,000 people of inefficiency and layover, but there's only 5,000 people who work there. Where are you going to find 1,000 people to get rid of? Those are engineering design jobs that need to happen, and that's been vertically integrated into the corporation, and now we're just going to outsource it somewhere else. The job is still there, but the money's going into somebody else's pocket.
I think very, very interesting comments, and I think you're absolutely right that the loss of the expertise of all these employees who are being laid off will damage BC Hydro very significantly, and will affect all of us in terms of the quality of service we get down the road. They're suffering from something about which they have no say whatsoever. They're, as it were, the victims, I think, of some of these bad decisions that I've been trying to explain earlier in my talk. So it's not good news. Other questions, comments?
Yeah, question. Obviously, you say that the numbers aren't adding up for what we're paying, what Hydro's paying, and what we're potentially selling it for. How long are the contracts supposed to last, and how rigid are they, or are we under threat of NAFTA if we change them, or maybe go for that?
So the question was, how long will the contracts last? They vary, and you can't actually get a final contract. There's a template on BC Hydro's website, of course, but it doesn't tell you what the fine details are. Most contracts are anywhere from 20 to 30 years, but there's one, I think, Forest Kerr, which is for a 195 megawatt project way up in the northwest, and it is for 60 years guaranteed. And they all have an inflation protector built in, some on half of the rate of inflation, but so that the contract owners, the developers, are very protected in terms of the commitment that Hydro has made to them in the contracts. All of this speaks to the issue of transparency. It's certainly to my way of thinking, we should really have much more knowledge about what the commitments are that Hydro has made. There are lots of very straightforward issues you can think about. For example, what about the very low water rental rates that we're charging? Some of the projects are charging us $125 roughly for the power, and the water rental that they're paying is about $1 for the use of the public water resource, and that's all. Well, a logical argument from my point of view would be to review that and say, well, is that a reasonable amount, that $1 for the use of the public water? Maybe it should be, I don't know, $20, something like that, however you want to calculate it. Are the contracts written in a way that guarantees that the company would remain whole if we did that Hydro would pick up the difference? I don't know. I'd like to know, but they're secret. So there's some issues there in terms of transparency that are very important.
I was just going to ask, are there any advantages that have come up from the Runner River project?
Well, I'm not an advocate of them, so I guess that's, but I mean, I'm not opposed to all of them. I think there are a few locations where it may make sense that if you get enough power from the project and there isn't much environmental damage, that may make sense. But by and large, these projects just don't deliver very much energy. And you have to, here's an analogy. It's a bit of a far-reaching one, okay? But if you remember, maybe I'm being unfair to Mal, but back in the late 50s and 60s, he thought that every village should have his little steel plant. We should build one there. That didn't make any sense. For us to build all these little power plants on these beautiful rivers that only generate, 5 or 10 megawatts of power, doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, the cost of construction is very high in relation to the energy you're getting, and the damage environmentally is quite significant. So I don't think that's, for the most part, a very smart thing to do. And it wouldn't be happening except for the policy framework that the government established that made it very attractive for power developers to do that. Yeah.
So I think you raised a lot of really valid questions in terms of BC Hydro, and for me the kind of principal issue I think would be that fundamentally the rates have been too low in the past and continue to be too low. And when I saw the rate hike come through, I was kind of an advocate for that because I think that would have equalised a lot of the issues we're having. So from the questions that you've raised, if you were in charge of BC Hydro, if you were Christy Clark, how would you start to skin this cat? How would you start to fix the issues of BC Hydro?
Well, some things I think we're stuck with, and it's very unfortunate. But certainly I would stop any new purchases of private power. And I would also take off all the constraints that the energy plans in the 2010 Clean Energy Act have placed on BC Hydro and see it as the vehicle for the future energy that we may or may not need. Obviously, there's a lot more that needs to be done with respect to conservation. Most environmental organizations have rightly pointed out that we need to spend a lot more in that area. In terms of the industrial power and these big mines and the LNG and so on, minimally they should be required to pay the marginal cost of new power. Whatever it's costing us to acquire power for them, they should have to pay for. And beyond that, they should be paying minimally for the cost of all the other infrastructure that the province is putting in place for them. Because that too is an indirect kind of subsidy that we're making. So down the road as well, there's a question about whether we should be thinking about rebalancing the actual rate structure. We've got three main categories. There's some subcategories within that, but we've got the transmission rate, which is the very large industrial customers who take electricity at high voltage. So they don't have the distribution costs for hydro and so on because it's basically one bill to a big mine or a big pulp mill. But nonetheless, arguably they should be paying a larger share. That $40 a megawatt hour is rather cheap. Going back to another point that you made about the pricing, I mean, in some ways the sad thing about pricing is this, that if hydro had not made all these, was forced to make all these bad decisions, arguably from a conservation point of view, higher prices do make some sense. The question is how to do that in a way that doesn't result in a lot more energy poverty. And it's tricky to do, and it's not easy, but if that's the goal, I think it can be done. You do want to raise prices. Also, very low prices for industrial users doesn't give them much incentive to actually make their mines and pulp mills more efficient. So in that regard, price will have an effect of, higher price will have an effect of making them more aware of the conservation that they should be doing. The sad thing is that if hydro was still getting this kind of revenue that it was before, and were to raise prices for conservation reasons and had that extra money, they could then reinvest it in positive environmental programs, in the built environment in terms of energy efficiency, things like that. But they're not going to have any of this money now. It's sort of a flow through. There was a table that I didn't include here. I may have it on the, yeah, let's see if I can find it here further. Yeah, this is how much we're now paying for private power purchases. Go back to 2003, 290 million. I did this in the fall, but actually I checked with the latest submission Hydro's made to the Utilities Commission yesterday, and in 2014 they were projecting that it would be 939 million to buy private power a year. This isn't a company that's total revenue is about 3.2, 3.3 million, okay? Now it's up to 1.1 billion that we're now paying, projected for 2014 for private power purchases. Sure, new energy is much more expensive, but we're not getting any assets for all this money we're spending. In the past, when BC Hydro built facilities, and there were lots of issues around flooding and all of that, and no question there were huge environmental issues that were not properly handled at the time, but nonetheless, we ended up owning it. And as a result of owning it, we ended up with relatively affordable electricity. None of this is providing us as the ratepayers with any asset, and that's a real problem.
Thank you, John, for a most insightful discussion, lecture today. I would like to leave a few minutes so others can talk to you personally. We have to be on here by 4, but if I could just make a couple of observations. And I know I see students from REM here, but I think it was very interesting your talk today about what's going on in terms of cross-subsidization. And I think we have to remember, of course, that BC Hydro is not the only company caught up in this process of cross-subsidization. It's going on in Ontario, it's going on in Germany. I mean, it's a very typical phenomenon. How we get ourselves into this, which I think is perhaps the subject of perhaps another book, in which if BC Hydro had not been, if you like, coerced into some of these actions, what would be the outcome? How would they have managed the electricity markets? How would they have regulated this in the absence of, of the political machinations going on? The other thing for students that I find very interesting here is the whole issue. This is basic economics, but the whole issue of concentrated benefits and diffused cost. And this is one of these things where obviously there are people in the private sector who are more than eager to capitalize on this, and of course the public really, not until it's too late, see the implications of these types of contracts and arrangements, because they may only add marginally to their bills. But the last thing I find very interesting, and it's like more of an intergenerational equity question, is what we're doing to future generations, how we're adding additional costs, in most cases here unnecessarily, the lack of transparency, so people really do not understand the trade-offs that are being involved in these very grand schemes and decisions that are made. So lots of instructive lessons, John. I really, really enjoyed it and appreciate it. And perhaps there's another book here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.